Hey everyone, welcome to Travel Through Stories. My name is Sean, and today I want to talk about all the books that I read in March. In March, I read 9 books. I realized that there are 10 books here. I read the final Jan Fosse Septology novel. I think I finished it on April 2nd or April 3rd, so I figured I'd just throw it in here and talk about it now as it makes more sense. March was a pretty interesting reading month, I think, for me. It had some of the highest highs that I think I'll have all year, and some of the lowest lows I hope that I have. One of these books is easily going to make my top books of the year, and probably makes my favorite books of all time. And some of these books, well, I kind of forgot about them the day after I finished them, because I found them to just be so forgettable and uninteresting, but we'll get there. And I'll try to be a bit quicker than I have been in the past, as most of the books that I really want to talk about I've either already talked about or am currently planning on talking about very shortly. The first book I read actually is one that I haven't talked about, and I really should have because I really enjoyed it, and that's Scattered All Over the Earth by Yoko Tawada, which is translated from the Japanese by Margaret Mitsutani. This book was really good. The reason I didn't make a full video on it, where I probably should have, was because I understood all the parts of it and I understood what she was getting at and all these different parts, but I didn't really understand the whole point that this book was making. And I think this book is the first book in a proposed trilogy, so that kind of makes sense. But this book is really interesting. It's about a group of characters that sort of all come together in an unlikely way. The most interesting character, I think, is a character named Hiroko, who is from the island of Sushi. She's from Japan, but in this world, Japan doesn't really exist anymore. It's hinted at that there was some sort of ecological disaster and it sunk into the ocean. And so people kind of know about Japan, but it's fading out of people's memories, and the only thing that they really know about it is that sushi came from there, as the only thing that kind of still exists from Japan are all of these sushi restaurants that are nearby. But this ecological disaster that Japan had sort of displaced all of the Japanese people, and so they're kind of, well, scattered all over the world. And Hiroko is one of those displaced people, and she's living in Denmark at the opening of this book. And she's really fascinating because she speaks this homemade language that she calls Panska. Panska basically being from pan, Greek for all or everywhere, and ska to make it sound like a Scandinavian language, right? Like Norsk or Islandska. It's basically, this homemade language is basically an amalgam of all of these different Scandinavian languages all put together into one. And there's this other Danish character named Knut who hears Hiroko on TV talking about and talking in this homemade language. And he's a linguist, so he becomes very interested in Hiroko, and they meet up and they travel around Europe. But what's so interesting about these two characters is that in this book we get all of these different perspectives. Each chapter is from a different character's perspective. And when we're from Knut's perspective, the way he hears Hiroko's language is in this, I mean, it's rendered in the translation in kind of a broken English, right? What we would call broken English. But when we're in Hiroko's perspective, it's completely fluid and completely not broken. And so this is a book that really is about language, and especially language in a more globalized world. Pretty early on, she's asked why she doesn't just speak in English, as English is the lingua franca of the world, essentially. And she basically responds that she doesn't speak English because then she's scared that she'll be sent to America, and America is a terrible and scary place to live because it's underdeveloped, especially in terms of its healthcare system. But Hiroko explains how she came up with this language that she speaks in, and I think it's actually worth reading. Panska was not made in a laboratory or by a computer. It's a language that just sort of came into being as I said things that people somehow understood. Comprehensibility is what's most important. So with that as my standard, I talked as much as I could every day. This was my great discovery, that the human brain has a language creating function. You don't have to pick out one language to study and learn from textbooks. If you just listen carefully to people around you, picking out sounds, repeating them, feeling the patterns of the language as a rhythm that reverberates through your body while you're speaking, eventually they'll turn into a new language. A long time ago, most immigrants headed for one specific country and stayed there until they died, so they only had to learn the language spoken there. Now, when people are always on the move, our language becomes a mixture of all the scenes we pass through on the way. There are also languages called pidgin, but they're always connected to business, so they don't really apply to me. I have nothing to sell. The only thing I deal in is language. And so Canute seeks her out and they meet up, and essentially what they do is go on this quest to find another Japanese person that Hiroko can speak to in her native language. And on the way, they gather all of these other very interesting characters. There's a trans woman from India. There's a Greenlander who is pretending to be Japanese because people kept mistaking him as an Inuit, and that kind of gets conflated here with Japanese. And so there's all of these really interesting cultural misunderstandings and linguistic challenges as we get these point of view chapters from all of these different characters' perspectives as they're all communicating and roaming around Europe, mainly in Denmark and Germany, but they're all communicating in a language that, for most of them, it isn't their native language. And so it's a really interesting book, but like I said, I couldn't really see exactly what all of these parts were doing together. This book is clearly like apocalyptic in a way, as it's clearly about globalization and immigration crises, as this whole book takes place in Europe, but almost all the characters come from without Europe. And so I'm really excited to see where this book goes. I really think that Tawada is a really good writer. I think this book is really well written. It's really smart. It touches on a lot of different issues. And I'm excited to see where it goes. The next book I read was Warlock by Oakley Hall. And I already spoke quite a bit about this book, so I'll be brief here. But essentially, what this book is a Western, kind of based on the town of Tombstone, Arizona, which had this very famous shootout at the OK Corral between these two men. And essentially in this book, we get this very Western plot where we have this famous gunslinger come marshal of the town of Warlock named Clay Blaisdell, who is brought in to protect the town, essentially. And then the force that's acting against this town, that's threatening this town, is this band of outlaws led by a man named Abe McQuone. And so at the very center of this book, we have these two men who represent these two opposing forces. And they kind of just come to head in this novel as you would expect in a Western. And so this book is really interested in the Old West and in how this culture of cowboys and lawlessness has really infiltrated its way into the American ethos. This book came out, I believe, in 1958. And so Oakley Hall is writing this throughout the 50s. And so he draws a lot of interesting kind of implicit comparisons and parallels between the history and the politics of the Old West and the 1950s that he's living in. There's a lot of like Cold War politics in here. There's a lot of McCarthyism and stuff like that. And there's actually, and this is something that I completely forgot to talk about in my review, there's a lot of politics within this book. As this book takes place in, I believe, 1880, maybe 1881, there's a lot of politics in here about the Reconstruction period and about how people from Union states get along with people from former Confederate states, as the town that they're in, Warlock, is way over in Arizona. But so it's full of basically all of these immigrants from the North and the South. And so there's this tension at the heart of this book, or kind of at the center of this book, between the former Union states and the former Confederate states, and how these people interact and how they come from very different cultural backgrounds. But yeah, mainly this book is just a lot of fun. It's a lot of fun to read. It's filled with just an amazing cast of characters who are all very quirky, very funny. Again, there's something I didn't mention in my review. This book is very, very funny. But yeah, this is just a very good American classic that's been pretty influential. If you're interested in writers like Thomas Pynchon, Thomas Pynchon provides the blurb on the back of this book. He was very influenced by this. If you're interested in writers like Cormac McCarthy, if you're interested in the Western genre, this is really a book that you should check out. All right, and the next book that I read that took up a significant portion of my month was The Kindly Ones by Jonathan Littell, translated from the French by Charlotte Mandell. How do I talk about this book in just a few minutes? This book is a 1,000-page fictional memoir of an SS officer named Maximilian Aue. And we follow Maximilian Aue, which is in his head, and he drags us along. We don't really follow him, he drags us to all of these great historical events that we all know about. We witness through him the Battle of Stalingrad. We witness one of the death marches to Auschwitz. We witness the fall of Berlin. all of these big events, kind of Forrest Gump style, as we're pulled to witness all of these from this perspective of this SS officer. And so this book is, as I'm sure you can tell, quite problematic, as, again, we're from the perspective of a literal Nazi. I won't say too much more here, because, again, I've already spoken about it, but one thing I did want to note, because I realized after Echo from Echoes of Lost Libraries commented and asked about the prose style of this book, I realized that I totally forgot to talk about the prose, which is kind of unlike me. I usually like to talk about the prose. The prose in this book, I didn't think was that good, to be honest. I thought it was very, very dry, very mechanical, very banal, honestly, which I do think is one of the points of this book. I think Littell purposefully wrote this in a very dry, very mechanical way because it fits the themes of this book quite nicely. That is, there isn't really anything that exciting going on in the prose, but that's because Max's worldview doesn't invite this kind of exuberant outlook. It's mainly just banal in a lot of ways. So yeah, the prose isn't really that exciting. And for a 1,000-page book to not have exciting prose is often a deal breaker for me. I mean, I really like prose. I need a book that has like interesting prose going on with it. This book doesn't really have that, but the perspective it offers, the perspective of being inside the head of a Nazi, an SS officer, is strange, horrifying, problematic, but pretty interesting, actually. I think this actually is a pretty good book overall, though it's definitely not for everyone. It really felt like just staring into the abyss. Anyways, the next books that I read, and I'm going to just kind of talk about it as if it's one book, is Septology by Fosse. I read the first two books at the end of March, and I finished book 3 at the beginning of April. But I figured I would just talk about it all now because it doesn't make sense to only talk about the first 3 and leave the third book to talk about next month. I love Fosse. He's one of my favorite living authors. I've read quite a few of his other works, most notably Trilogy, which I think is actually being republished either this year or next year by Dalkey Archives, which is something to look out for. It's really good. It's much smaller, much slimmer than Septology. And I've actually read the first book in Septology, The Other Name, I read at the beginning of last year. But I'll try to be as brief as possible right now because I'm working on a much longer, much more full review of Septology, which I'm just going to review in one video. This book is about a man named Asla who is living in Norway, kind of outside of a city called Bjørgvin, which is just Bergen, essentially. And he is a painter. He's older, he's a widower, and this book opens with him painting this painting, which I can't really show you here, but it's basically the cover of these books, which is just 2 lines crossing, one purple line and one brown line. And this painting is, of course, incredibly important, and we keep coming back to it. In fact, each of the 7 parts of this novel, Septology, which I should note, by the way, it's called Septology because there are basically 7 parts. It's published in 3 volumes in a trilogy. I'm just going to refer to it as a single book. It's Septology. It's a single work. But what is incredibly interesting about this book is that Asla has a friend who lives in Bjørgvin, who is also named Asla, who is also a painter, who has lived a very similar life to the narrator Asla, the first Asla. And so what we really get in this novel are these 2 versions of Asla. But most of this book takes place inside the head of the first Asla, the narrator Asla, as he is just constantly remembering all of these memories. And he keeps repeating this phrase that he sees these memories. But he also remembers things that aren't really his memories. And it's unclear if he's like seeing into a potential future or seeing into like a different version of his same life. And there's all of these really interesting questions about memory, about time, and all this different stuff. But so he's constantly just thinking throughout this book. I mean, a large part of this book takes place on his drives back and forth from the small town that he is living in and Bjørgvin. So he's constantly just driving and thinking. But what's so interesting about this book is he is constantly meditating on all of these memories, but we're also meditating on these as well, as the prose is just hypnotic and rhythmic and meditative. I saw in an interview, Fosse refers to his prose style as Langsam-Prosa, which basically just means slow prose, as the prose is just so hypnotic and rhythmic and meditative. There's no full stops throughout this entire book. It's just a single continual sentence, but it's not a sentence. It's not like a single sentence in the form of like a Krasna-Horkai novel or something like that. Instead, it's just very slow and repetitive and meditative. But this has a really profound effect while reading it. It's very difficult to describe. You really just have to read the prose. But this book is really, I think, about three main things: memory, art, and God. This is actually a very religious book, which is kind of surprising that I like it so much because I'm not a religious person. But it's very religious in like a mystical, spiritual way, and it really places art and God as the two most powerful and mysterious forces in the world. Fosse actually converted to Catholicism quite late in life. When he was younger, he eschewed all organized religion. He left the Church of Norway as soon as he could, which is something that he shares, by the way, with Asla. And he actually said in an interview that the thing that really brought him back to God was writing, because when he writes, he doesn't plan anything. He just sits down and begins to write. And he talks about how it's almost like it's less that he's writing and more that he's hearing something being told to him, and he's kind of the vessel through which these words find their way to the page. And he basically talks about how this creation, how art is this inexplicable power in a way, how it's this great mystery that he can't explain. And so much of this novel is him exploring these big questions about God and about art, these two forces that he doesn't fully understand. But yeah, I mean, Septology is just absolutely gorgeous. I mean, the prose is something I can't say enough about. It's just wonderful to read, and this book is so emotional, so beautiful. It's amazing. I think it's an instant classic. I think we'll be talking about this trilogy in the exact same way that we talk about something like Samuel Beckett's trilogy. Fosse has just been a personal favorite of mine for a few years now, and this just solidified him as one of my favorite, if not my favorite, living author. More thoughts on this to come. I'm trying to work through a much longer script for the Septology, trying to kind of solidify all my thoughts on it. The next book that I read is Love in the Big City by Sang-Young Park and translated by Anton Her. This is a book that was longlisted for the International Booker, has been hyped up a lot in various places, and I really didn't like this book. Let me start with what I think it did well, though. Well, first off, let me say what it's about. It's about this young man named Young, who is probably kind of some version of the author. There's like an afterword where the author talks about how this is very much based on his experiences. But it's about this guy named Young who is in his 20s and 30s throughout this book. And he is queer, and he basically is just dating all of these different men. And this book is basically split up into 4 different stories in which he dates 4 different men. And so it's really about his dating life and kind of the various emotions that are elicited through dating each of the people that he dates. And I think the author does do a pretty good job of kind of exploring these different emotions, exploring, I guess, dating as a millennial. And what my favorite part about this book, I think, were the descriptions of the nightlife in Seoul. This book takes place in Seoul, Korea. I probably should have noted that. But Young is going out to all of these bars and meeting all these different people. And so the nightlife of Seoul really comes to life. And I think the descriptions of all of that I found to be really interesting. My problems with this book is just that I just didn't find it that interesting. I don't think it did anything that was particularly interesting. I think it portrayed these queer relationships in some interesting ways, and of course the representation of having more books about queer people, queer characters, I think is obviously a really good thing. But it didn't really do anything past that for me. Like the prose was just very, very plain, mundane, realist. These stories were just very realist. They didn't really provide many insights outside of Young's kind of experiences. I don't know. I just found this book entirely forgettable. I found it to just be kind of boring, not very good. I'm pretty glad that it didn't make the short list. I don't know. I guess I shouldn't say that as bad. I thought it was fine. I just found it entirely forgettable. The next book I read was also entirely forgettable, which is Jonas Eika's After the Sun. This was another book that was long listed for the Booker, though I actually picked this book up when it first was published in the US last summer, and I wanted to read it because he was Danish and young, and I thought that might be pretty interesting. But I didn't actually read it until this past month. This is a short story collection that has 5 different short stories. There's kind of 4 stories because 2 of the stories are basically a continuation of each other. And these stories span the world. They take place basically all over the world. And they have a lot of thematic overlap, of course, as a good short story collection should. And some of them are okay. I think Bad Mexican Dog is one of them that there's kind of 2 short stories in here called Bad Mexican Dog. I thought that one was quite good. It explores kind of the life of this beach boy in Cancun as he's dealing with all of these tourists. And it really talks a lot about colonialism and consumerism, and especially consumerism when it comes to sex, as this young boy basically needs to sell himself as this sort of sexual object, this kind of indigenous or native sexual object for these tourists to engage with. I thought some of that was cool. There's another short story called Alvin, which is about like stock trading and sex. I don't know. Some of the stuff in here was kind of cool. Some of the writing was like unique and interesting. And I think the way he put together some themes were pretty cool. Like putting together sex and colonialism and sex and the stock market trading was interesting. But like, I don't know. I've forgotten pretty much everything from this short story collection pretty much the minute I put it down. I just found it to be unremarkable, not that interesting, and pretty forgettable. I don't know. I won't say anything more because I don't really like to be too negative on this channel. But anyways, the next book that I read was the posthumous memoirs of Brás Cubas by Machado de Assis. Machado de Assis is a Brazilian author, and I've actually read this book before. I read it in an earlier translation that I don't want to find. It was translated as Epitaph of a Small Winter, and I read it quite a few years ago, and I really didn't like it. So this new translation just came out, I believe last year, maybe the year before, and it was actually sent to me by Boxwalla, which was quite cool. And so I figured I would give it another read and give it another try. And I have to say, I do like it a lot more now that I've read it a second time. Basically what this book is a fictional memoir written by a guy named Brás Cubas right after he died. He's writing it from beyond the grave. It's a posthumous memoir, after all. And so it's very playful and very meta and very strange. So it really feels like something that would have been published in like the 1970s or the 1980s. It really feels like a postmodern book, but the book was published in like 1881. So this book is really interesting basically because it seems like it was just so far ahead of its time. Like it's shocking to think that like Charles Dickens and Herman Melville are near contemporaries, or a bit older, but they're near contemporaries of Machado de Assis. And so the conceit of this book is fascinating, where we're getting this voice of this dead guy as he recounts his entire life. And the voice is, I think, the best part about this book. The voice is absolutely hilarious. Brás Cubas is easily distracted, but he's very, very witty. He says at one point early on that he prefers anecdotes to reflections. And so we get all of these just digressions and these anecdotes. And I actually like the digressions and the anecdotes a lot more than the main plot. The main plot of this novel, the basically the retelling of his life, I found to be the most uninteresting part of this book. I didn't really care too much about like the main plot. It was more the voice and the narrator that I found so interesting. But there are all these just great moments where Brás Cubas will tell you a story, but then he'll address you directly. As far as I know, no one has yet described his own delirium. I will do so here, and science will thank me for it. If you, the reader, are not much given to contemplating such mental phenomena, feel free to skip this chapter and jump straight to the plot. However lacking in curiosity you may be, though, I would just say that what went on in my head for some 20 or 30 minutes was actually very interesting. And so he's constantly breaking, the fourth wall, because he has this almost omnipotent perspective. And in fact, there are all these really cool moments early on where he sees human history like God would. He sees time as happening kind of all at once rather than linear. And so he's an interesting character in just that respect. Assis really plays with his deadness and kind of what that means for his perspective and his voice in some pretty cool ways. There's a moment much later on in this book that I think is just so interesting and quite funny, because he's talking about how, or he notes at one point that as he's getting older, as in the narrative he's getting older, his style has changed, right? And then he just writes this kind of digression directly to a critic of that statement. My dear critic, a couple of pages earlier, after saying that I was 50 years old, I added, quote, "You will already have sensed that my style is no longer as nimble as it was in the early days. You may find this sentence incomprehensible in light of my present state. However, I call your attention to the subtlety of that thought. I do not mean that I am now older than when I started the book. Death does not age you. What I mean is that in every phase of narrating my life, I experienced the corresponding emotion. Good grief, must I explain everything?" And so yeah, I actually thought it was a pretty interesting book. It really wasn't my favorite. Again, I think a lot of like the meat of this book I didn't find too interesting. Perhaps if I was a bit more familiar with like Brazilian history, I would have found it more interesting. But the overall conceit, the narrative voice, the writing style, I all found that to just be really, really fun, really funny, really pleasant. The last book that I read is Aurelia by Kathryn Davis. Kathryn Davis is a writer that I wanted to read for a while because she's kind of this just not very popular author. Almost all of her books on Goodreads have like between 2 and 3 stars, which I just find to be funny. But I always see like real writers talking about how she is one of the most original and creative and innovative voices in American fiction. And so I'm just kind of interested in her. And this is her latest book, Aurelia, came out, I believe, in 2021. And it's the first part in a projected, I think, 3-part memoir of her life. And this is a strange little book full of, almost similar to Machado de Assis, full of just digressions and anecdotes and these little stories. But once again, I mean, the writing style and the voice is just what carries this book along. The writing style of this book is just absolutely gorgeous. It opens with just the great line, "There are points in your life when you think you're about to become whatever's next." So this book it follows her sort of early life, some of her first loves in high school and stuff like that. But what this book does that is so interesting is mix this memoir with all of this literary criticism. And her literary criticism is super expansive. There are just brilliant readings in this short book on Virginia Woolf's To the Lighthouse, on the TV show Lost, on the movie The Seventh Seal, all these different artists from all these different realms of highbrow literature and kind of lowbrow popular literature. The narrator is just so witty, so erudite, so smart. And so we get all of these just wonderful readings of these famous texts. And then there's just this contemplation on the death of her husband, really kind of at the center of this book. And so this book is, as I'm sure you can tell, incredibly difficult to summarize or describe because it's so wide-reaching, it's so expansive, and it's tiny. I read it in one sitting. The biggest takeaway from this book for me is that Kathryn Davis can write. So I'm looking forward to reading more of her memoirs when they're published. But I also ordered a couple of her her fiction books because she seems like a really interesting character in American fiction right now. And after reading this, I mean, I think she's worth picking up. I think she's worth reading. So those are the books that I read in March. I would say the highlights for me were Fosse, Hall, and Tawada, and also Littell, but in a very different way. But let me know if you've read any of these books. I'd be really interested to know what you thought of them, especially some of the kind of more popular ones. I'm interested because I haven't really seen any dissenting voices on especially Love in the Big City. It seems overwhelmingly positive, and I'm interested to know what you guys think of it. But anyways, for now, thanks for watching. There's another short story called Alvin, which is about, I don't even know. What the fuck is Alvin about, dude? Oh, God.